In 1348, the brutal regime of Norman England had faced a ferocious enemy, a plague that spared neither rich nor poor. In the summer of that year, the Black Death had hit the tiny village of Tusmore in Oxfordshire, home to about 20 men, women and children, all serfs to their feudal lord, Sir Roger de Cottesford. These faint bumps in the ground are the only sign that people once lived here.
When the plague arrived in Britain, one chronicler described it as death coming into our midst like a black smoke, a rootless phantom of no mercy. Many perceived it as a divine punishment, the terrible judgment of God. And of course, for the men and women of Britain, this was an apocalypse. Half the population was wiped out. And in places like this, Sir Roger de Cottesford's serf village, there wasn't a single survivor. Which of course meant that if you were one of the few left standing somewhere in the neighbourhood, you were a prize commodity. Who was going to farm Sir Roger's land now that his entire workforce had gone? Why, of course, you were, and you weren't going to do it for free. After centuries of feudal exploitation by the lord of the manor and a domineering church, the bonds that tied people to their masters were finally loosening. The sixth age of Britain was dawning, and you can almost sense the medieval population stretching out to explore its newfound liberty.
The village of Fobbing in Essex was home in the 1370s to a man called Thomas Baker. He and plague survivors all over Britain had found that their labour was now in high demand. They began to insist on higher wages and lower rents, but the authorities were having none of it and responded with blanket pay restrictions. Then, to add insult to injury, they imposed a punishing direct tax, the poll tax of 1380. Everyone, rich or poor over the age of 15, had to pay 12 pence, a massive sum. For people like Thomas Baker, nearly a month's pay.
The response to this was one of absolute uproar in the English countryside. And we can see this from the fact that the tax rolls show that almost 200,000 to 300,000 people vanished from the taxation records. People were concealing the fact that they had children over the age of 15, were concealing their elderly parents and relatives, and trying to minimise the burden of taxation they paid.
The tax collectors arrived here in Fobbing on the 30th of May, 1381. They threatened violent enforcement, but were suddenly confronted with a furious crowd led by Thomas Baker, and no longer content to take this kind of abuse lying down.
The outbreak of a revolt in Fobbing and the villages round it was almost entirely organic and spontaneous, and that local people from these villages rose up and gathered together, probably in very small numbers at the beginning. And we know from the trial records, the first named rebel, Thomas Baker of Fobbing, seems to have been the very original leader of this small group of Essex men, whose numbers soon snowballed very quickly.
Within hours, other villages across the county took Baker's lead and saw off the tax collectors. Within days, the roads of Essex and Kent were crowded with bands of men circulating in open rebellion against the oppressive forces of church and state.
Here and throughout the country, there must have been a real thirst for insurrection, because within just a few weeks, there were uprisings from York to Cornwall. Chroniclers tried to demonise these crowds, describing them as a mob of rustici, illiterate yokels, and as a result, history has remembered the event as the Peasants' Revolt. But it's a misnomer. Most of the protesters were tradespeople and small-time farmers, men and women with modest incomes and a variety of grievances. What they shared was a burning ambition to try and change things. So Thomas Baker and the people of Fobbing found themselves on the road, travelling with thousands of others to confront the ruling elite.
They marched on London. For many, it would have been the first time they'd set eyes on the riches of the capital. By the evening of the 12th of June, various rebel bands started joining together, thousands of them all looking for one man, the 14-year-old king, Richard II.
They learn that Richard has moved to the Tower of London with his immediate household, and so really they want a personal interview with him, and that's why so many of them come to the Tower. But far from being their enemy, they saw Richard as the one person capable of delivering their demands. Their watchword that the rebel bands exchanged between each other was, "Who do you hold with?" And the answer that you had to give to avoid being killed was, "With Richard and with the true commons of England." So they really did have a sentimental attachment to monarchy.
The rebels were furious when, having come all this way, they were unable to see the king. So they ran riot. Looting, burning, baying for the blood of their hate figures, the king's councillors, who symbolised to them centuries of oppression. One of the most despised was Simon Sudbury, Archbishop of Canterbury and Chancellor of England. When on the 14th of June the king finally rode out to speak with rebel leaders, Sudbury was left safe at the Tower, or so he thought. Within minutes, the rebels had gained access and ran amok through the royal apartments.
Who would ever have believed that such rustics, and most inferior ones at that, would dare to enter the chamber of the king and of his mother with their filthy sticks? They arrogantly lay and sat on the king's bed while joking, and several asked the king's mother to kiss them.
But the joke stopped when they stumbled upon Simon Sudbury.
Sudbury's fate was sealed when the rebels entered the Tower. Some say that he was found praying in the chapel of the Tower, others that he'd actually tried to make an escape, but was betrayed by a woman who saw him trying to get out of the Watergate and onto the Thames. Sudbury is dragged out of the Tower and is taken onto Tower Hill, and there he is brutally beheaded. This is a particularly gruesome killing, as it was done by someone who'd obviously had no skill. One of the rebels simply did the job himself, rather messily.
It took 8 strokes to sever Sudbury's head, and in triumph the rebels displayed it on London Bridge. But success was brief. Within hours, the authorities regrouped and mounted a savage backlash. The would-be freedom fighters soon paid for the revolt with their lives. Today, just one ghoulish trophy remains as proof of the protesters' brief power over life and death, and it hides forgotten in a church in Suffolk. Simon Sudbury's head's been preserved because his supporters wanted to turn him into a martyr, a man who died in defence of his king's God-given right to extract money from his people. But of course, for his killers, this was a judicial execution, and the quirk of history is that this sorry relic hasn't come to represent the power of authority, but the power of popular protest. Those few days when Sudbury's head glared down from London Bridge and the revolt gathered momentum across the country were a turning point for Britain's men and women. A new folk memory had been born. It was the beginnings of a realisation that if you were unhappy with your place in society, there was a way of making your voice heard. One thing was for sure. The Crown didn't dare impose another poll tax for nearly 300 years. This so-called peasants' revolt was the political consequence of the Black Death, but the plague had an even greater impact on people's mind and spirit. Below St Bride's Church in London is an ancient crypt. Down here is a vision of hell on earth. These are bones of medieval men and women, hundreds of them. Many probably plague victims. At the height of the epidemic, death was everywhere you turned, and often there weren't even enough survivors to bury the dead. All over the country, this had an enormous effect on how medieval people viewed the world. A daily diet of images like these fed a deep anxiety about the afterlife. Even if you lived a relatively blameless life, in the medieval mind, after death, you had purgatory to deal with. Purgatory was an uncertain, painful limbo where your soul awaited its final judgment. Here you retained your own identity and your own catalogue of sins, and it was up to the living to pray for a speedy and lenient absolution on your behalf. So, with death on their minds and an obsession with salvation, the people of Britain began to search for a fresh spiritual identity. It was a path that would lead away from the established church and towards intimate and bizarre alternatives.
Part of the spiritual crisis that comes at this time is realizing that you have to take some responsibility for your own salvation and really be very careful to make all the right preparations through prayer and meditation. Because if you think about the suffering that they've actually seen during the Black Death, the kind of hell on earth, and if purgatory is worse than this, people are really going to be quite terrified. People were really losing faith in some of the more traditional religious orders, where typically a third of the monks died, and they thought, well, you're obviously not really that close to God. You don't have God's ear if all of you are dying as well.
So people cast about for less vulnerable religious role models. And in droves, they turned towards a mystical, reclusive order, the Anchorites, holy men or women who lived as hermits, enclosed within individual parish churches.
Anchorites had always been here. They're part of quite an ancient tradition, but we do see a real explosion of interest in them. And this has to do with the Anchorites being solitary people who may not have been as susceptible to the Black Death, but also whose prayers were considered to be more efficacious. They were the ones that would really get you through purgatory.
One anchoress, a female anchorite, spent 40 years shut up in a cell off the south wall of St. Julian's, rebuilt today as a place of pilgrimage. We don't know her real name, but the parish called her Julian after the church. Here she prayed for local souls, the merchants and fishermen whose cry she would have heard from the busy quay nearby. And in exchange, they saved their pennies to pay for her life of pious isolation.
The money was really just to support her basic subsistence. She would have needed to employ a servant who would come and bring her food, who would regularly bring her new clothing, who would sort of clear out the cell. Of course, she wouldn't have had, indoor plumbing and ensuite facilities. It would have been, pretty unsanitary and unsavoury enclosed space from our modern point of view.
But far from regarding Julian as divorced from real life, the locals would have been proud of their anchoress and seen her as playing a vital role at the heart of their community.
The anchoress seems to have had regular contact with local people, with the sort of people who would have been giving money and leaving bequests. And so there must have been a grill or an opening on the outside of the cell as well, so that people could come, really for spiritual counselling, I suppose, ask the advice of the anchoress and have discussions with her. It may have been people who were having some sort of spiritual crisis. It may have been people who were undergoing periods of grief. We can't really know. The same reason why people would seek out counselling today.
We might think of their lives as trapped and claustrophobic, but people drew real strength from them. Confidence was creeping back into society, and for the first time in decades, people were looking to the future once more. This new optimism encouraged people to question the other great power base of the last 3 centuries, feudalism. This tyrannical class system was designed to prevent men and women from getting ideas above their station. But as their earning power increased and they enjoyed wealth their grandparents could only have dreamed of, people began to thumb their noses at the old social order.
In 1364, the authorities decided to put the population back in its place. They passed a very detailed law demanding that everyone should be dressed according to their estate and degree. So had you been walking down here 600 years ago, you'd have been able to spot a shepherd or a ploughman because he'd be wearing cloth worth less than 12 pence per yard. Or you could have marked out the wife of a craftsman because her fur collar could only be made of rabbit, lamb, fox or cat. Well, that was the theory. In practice, this was phantom legislation and almost impossible to enforce. But it does show just how uncomfortable central government was with the social mobility that was now part and parcel of medieval life.
A new model Englishman had burst onto the scene, the impatient social climber. The dramatic rise of the Paston family is typical of what was going on all over the country. Their story begins here, in the village of Paston in Norfolk. In the mid-1300s, a peasant farmer called Clement had a small holding outside the village.
Clement Paston was a good, plain husbandman. He went at one plough both winter and summer and rode to the mill on bare horseback with his corn under him.
I don't think you can take the description of the lowly origins of the Paston family at face value. It was some 75 years since Clement farmed these fields, and the portrait's probably coloured by resentment at what the Pastons went on to achieve. Because what's clear from other sources is that within just 2 generations, they went from working on this land to living here in a fine castle at the centre of a grand estate. Now they were wealthy, successful landowners with considerable power and the ear of the king. Of course, a drastic transformation of social status like that wasn't going to go unnoticed, and the Pastons were to spend the rest of their lives dogged by snobbery and desperate to keep up appearances.
The family's meteoric rise began back in the feudal world, where a peasant was regarded as little better than an animal. But instead of kowtowing to the system, Clement clubbed together with some relatives to send his son William to law school. The legal profession was booming in medieval Britain, as land had been carved up after the Black Death and there were plenty of disputes to resolve. This was a way for bright young men to get rich quick, and William Paston intended to be one of them.
William was extremely shrewd, clearly very intelligent, but also capable of a little sharp practice if he felt it was necessary, capable of making some very tough decisions in his own business dealings and in his personal life. He didn't get married till the age of 42, which meant that he was able to make an extremely advantageous match to an heiress, because by that stage he was a very successful lawyer, well on his way to becoming a High Court judge.
By middle age, William Paston was a wealthy man, one of the rising stars of the whole new echelon of medieval society, the nouveau riche.
Late medieval England can look very hierarchical, everyone in their place, and all of that was true, but behind that facade there was enormous scope for social mobility. It's possible in this period to rise from the peasantry to the upper ranks of the gentry or even the nobility in only 2 generations, as long as you covered over the traces of where you'd come from as efficiently and as quickly as you could.
This bid for aristocratic standing relied on putting your newfound wealth to work.
Conspicuous consumption is extremely important as an indicator of status. If you want to be accepted as a member of the upper classes, you have to speak, act, live, dress as the upper classes do. But money and dress by itself won't do. The crucial thing is the acquisition of land, because what that does is it gives you authority over the people who live and work on the land, people like William's father Clement. Authority over people gives you status, and it also gives you real power.
William bought all the land around Paston, and by his death had estates throughout Norfolk, which now passed to his son, John. the next step on the ladder required a couple of classic social climbing tactics. First, John married well. Next, he curried favour with Sir John Fastolf, a wealthy relation of his wife Margaret, making sure he was named in the will. The strategy paid off. And in 1459, just 40 years after his peasant grandfather's death, John Paston inherited Fastolf's home, Caister Castle.
John and Margaret, living at Caister, were really living the life of the upper ranks of the landed gentry, which was a very comfortable life indeed by the standards of the day. Caister was new, it was comfortable, it had all mod cons, brick-built, unusually for a place of this size, filled with luxurious furnishings, lots of silver plate, beautiful silverware that allowed them to eat in great splendour. We know also that they had carved furniture, beautiful tapestries. So this place was the height of luxury in the mid-15th century.
Right, worshipful husband, if you will be home at Caister this Christmas, it would be well for you to obtain 2 pewter vessels and 12 candlesticks, for we have too few of these to serve this place. As for your liveries, there can none be got here of the colour you would have, neither scarlet nor blue, nor good russets under 3 shillings per yard. Almighty God keep you, your wife, Margaret.
The Pastons were one of hundreds of newly gentrified families in medieval Britain. But even with a status symbol like Caister, John and Margaret still battled with constant reminders of the family's peasant past. And that kind of attack could be very public.
In May 1448, their chaplain was walking home in Norwich, and he had to pass the house of a neighbour of theirs with whom they were on very bad terms. This neighbour was also nouveau riche and also trying to pretend that he was a gentleman of long standing. And the argument developed when the chaplain failed to doff his hat to him in the street as he would to someone he considered to be a gentleman. The neighbour responded by addressing the chaplain as thee, which was an insultingly familiar form. You'd call a servant thee instead of the polite form you.
And so Wyndham drew out his dagger and said, "Shalt thou so, knave?" And his man began to cast stones. And with the noise of this affray, my mother and I came out of church, and Wyndham called us strong whores, and said the Pastons and all their kind were churls.
The ultimate insults were calling each other churl, which means not a gentleman but a peasant, and an unfree peasant at that, a villain. And that wouldn't have mattered so much if it hadn't been so close to the bone.
In 1466, John Paston, now a regular visitor at court, asked King Edward IV for a favour. Soon after, a royal declaration stated that the Paston family weren't of peasant stock after all, and had in fact descended from Norman aristocracy. Now, this was plainly untrue, but once the top authority in the land had backed them, the Pastons had arrived, and arrived for good.
The Paston family might seem a bit pretentious, but I think you can forgive their shameless ambition. Their energy and drive was typical of a growing number of people in medieval Britain. This was now a land of opportunity, and out of it was to emerge a surprising new breed of go-getter.
In the late Middle Ages, the ravages of the Black Death had almost halved the male labour force. And all of a sudden, employers had no choice but to let women into the workplace.
In the 12 and 1300s, you do find women travelling to earn their living, but now they're starting to flood into the towns. Whereas before, employment options were limited almost exclusively to work as a servant or a childminder or a prostitute, now there are new opportunities. Women flourish as apprentices to trade or formidable entrepreneurs. Some are granted full-scale citizenship and enjoy all the economic benefits that brings with it. For the lucky ones, this was the beginning of a brief golden age of self-determination and financial clout.
One of those lucky ones was a woman called Joanna Hill. In the 1420s and 30s, she and her husband Richard lived in a tenement on this site behind St Botolph's Church in London. Here Richard Hill ran the thriving St Botolph's Bell Foundry.
Bell founding was a growth industry, and I think the reason for this was that after the Black Death, there was more wealth around, and one of the things that people chose to spend their money on was building bell towers for churches. And so if you were good at casting bells, I think you could make quite a lot of money. Not the kind of huge riches of great merchants who traded in overseas trade, but for artisans, they were extremely prosperous.
This is one of the last two surviving bell foundries in Britain. They still use some of the techniques pioneered back in medieval times by bell makers like Richard Hill. His business boomed, and even today, 23 of his bells survive in churches from Cornwall to Rutland. But in May 1440, Richard died, and in his will he left the bell foundry to his widow, Joanna. Despite her loss, this was an opportunity for Joanna to show what she was made of.
Being a widow was the most advantageous condition in which a woman could find herself because she was now independent. Many women chose not to remarry, and they then, particularly in London, they were not only allowed, but they were actually expected to run their husband's business, to continue to train his apprentices, and really to be independent artisans or merchant women.
Joanna Hill's husband, Richard, clearly had the utmost faith in his wife's ability to do just that. And running a bell foundry was no mean feat.
I doubt if she actually cast the bells herself, but she'd been married to Richard Hill for probably 15 to 20 years, and she must have observed how the business was run. Now, it's a very considerable business. 4 apprentices, 6 other servants, a clerk, 2 or 3 women servants, the foreman, who was actually called the bell maker. So we're talking about perhaps somewhere between 15 and 20 in the workshop or in the household. So by medieval London standards, that's a very large unit of operation.
Joanna not only kept this business afloat, but under her management, the bell foundry flourished. Over the next year, she oversaw the making of more than 20 bells, and 7 of them are still used in churches today. One bell, cast that year, 1441, is a tenor bell made for a church in Colchester, which was bombed during the Second World War. Today it's found a new home in a new town, Basildon in Essex. If you look really closely at it, you can see how determined Joanna was to physically stamp her mark on the business.
Her husband's bells are marked with a shield with a ring and a cross. Joanna Hill's bells are marked with her husband's mark with, as it were, a difference. She put a little lozenge with a flower in it above her husband's shield. Now, the lozenge is the heraldic mark for women. So she was, as it were, deliberately, I think, saying it's a woman who is now running this business.
But Joanna didn't enjoy her newfound career for long. Just over a year after her husband's death, she also died. Church court records tell of a remarkable tale of one woman asserting her rights. It happened here in Bolton Percy, just south of York, and her name was Maud Shippen. On the 17th of October, 1355, she'd visited a man in the village called Robert Smith. An hour or so later, Maud claimed she was now his wife, and fortunately for her, she had a witness.
I, Margaret Thacker, was in the basement of Robert Smith's house, and I saw through the door Robert pushing and pulling Maud into the cowshed where he tried to know her carnally. Maud had said, "God forbid that you should know me carnally unless you will marry me." So Robert answered, "Behold my oath, if I take anyone to be my wife, I shall you if you will yield to me." And so Robert took her in his arms and threw her to the ground and knew her carnally.
It may sound as though Robert duped Maud just to legitimise a quick fling, but that's exactly how medieval marriages worked. As long as words of consent were exchanged, the union was recognised by the church and was legally binding. Maud Shippin, like an increasing number of ordinary women, understood the law. And so when Robert denied that he was married just a few weeks later, she was confident enough to fight back. On the morning of the 22nd of December, 1355, she set out from this village to travel the 9 miles to York, ready to argue her case in the church court.
Imagine Maud arriving here that cold December day and facing the imposing bulk of York Minster. She'd have had to make her way through all the bustle inside to the north transept where the court was in session. There she'd have been confronted by a judge and up to 20 court officials. Terrifying for her. They were well used to resolving cases like these. As many as 300 marriage disputes were heard here every year. Back then, women didn't count as legal entities, but in the eyes of the church, they had souls like anyone else. In sexual grey areas, it was the soul that was at stake. So in Maud's case, she could use the court to prove Robert's moral obligation to her. And on this occasion, Robert Smith's defence was hardly well thought out.
Robert produces witnesses trying to disprove this story, saying that he was away on that particular day. What he hasn't noticed is that he's got the dates wrong, and therefore his witnesses tell about his movements on a day that is 2 weeks earlier. So Robert really didn't have a leg to stand on legally.
Maud was now officially Mrs. Smith, and small victories like this were being won in church courts all over the country. But uniquely in York, hundreds of records have survived, some of the earliest evidence of this kind in Britain. They offer an intimate snapshot of medieval marriage and reveal a new stress not just on duty, but on love. These are the records from a poignant case of 1357, in which a 14-year-old boy, William Ongier, asked the court to annul his marriage to 16-year-old Joanna Malcake. 6 years earlier, William had been coerced into the arranged marriage, and this was no love match, as both of them were small children.
William is 8, Joanna is 10. Now this is perfectly possible under canon law. You can marry people when they're about 8 to 10 years old. There's a ceremony in the maternal estate, there's a chapel. After that ceremony, William and Joanna are put in a bed together and are sort of put on display overnight. These are sort of remnants of old marriage rituals.
After the wedding, William and Joanna spent the next 6 years apart while he went away to school. Then a couple of weeks before his 14th birthday, he was suddenly called back to Yorkshire, where Joanna had fallen pregnant, and not by him. Unwilling to continue with this sham, William sought to end the marriage at the court at York, testifying with anguished words.
It displeases me that I loved her once, for she doesn't value an affection that's upheld, and therefore for sure I intend never to consent to her that she be my wife.
The Minster Court decided theirs was no marriage. The ill-starred vows of William and Joanna's youth were annulled, and they went their separate ways to find love elsewhere. But their story is part of an increasing body of evidence that romance was becoming more central to medieval marriage.
These are love tokens, probably given as a promise of commitment to a future union. Hidden away inside this one, there are just 2 words, Ma souveraine, my queen. And the inscription here reads, Pour amour c'est doux, for a love so sweet. Rings like these and cases brought to the church courts, such as that of William Ongier, show that there are new values in marriage. There's an unabashed emphasis on the importance of love and affection, something that was very much in tune with the contemporary climate of self-belief.
And ordinary men and women weren't just standing up for what they wanted at home and in bed, but in public life too. A new kind of people power was in the making.
This is the head of a walking stick, carved out of antler and dating from around the beginning of the 1400s. Whoever it belonged to clearly had very little respect for the church, because it's a satirical representation of a monk's head. Caricatures like these weren't just comical. They encapsulated an antagonism that was felt towards a church that owned around 10% of the land and was thought of by many to be greedy and corrupt. Now, people were beginning to try and seek out their own routes to God.
This building in York was where these religious concerns would join forces with commercial enterprise. The headquarters of a group called the Trinity Guild. Members were local men and women, mostly merchants and shopkeepers, who'd clubbed together to save their souls. Each paid a small subscription, and in return, a priest would pray for them, the only way these modest people could afford to buy their own piece of heaven.
We're looking at the chapel of the religious fraternity, and the site is purchased in 1356 with the intention of constructing a guild hall on top of it. And that's the structure we're looking at now, a two-storey building with a brick undercroft in which there would have been a hospital and then an open hall that's timber framed above it at first floor level. And we have a series of amazing account rolls that tell us about the purchase of the building materials, the brick from the Carmelite friars and the timber from the Forest of Gold Trees just outside York. And it tells us about the sheer cost of that building programme, but also about the feat of engineering that building a structure such as this would have entailed.
The religious centre of business was downstairs. Here in the chapel, a priest said daily prayers for the guild members. Meanwhile, through in the hospital, 13 poor men and women convalescing at the guild's expense joined in to give those prayers extra weight. It sounds to us a rather odd setup, but it was to grow into a British institution. Upstairs in the main chamber was the secular life of the guild. With the praying taken care of, guild members got down to business. In this room, merchants would talk shop and celebrate feast days. And it was here that a young boy starting work for the first time was introduced to an emerging commercial elite.
What would an apprentice have seen had he walked in here at the beginning of the 15th century?
Well, you can just imagine actually the impression that this space would have had on someone like an apprentice. You enter it via the screen's passage, over which there would have been a gallery with minstrels probably playing. But then as you move up the hall towards the dais end, that's where the real visual emphasis in this building is. You can imagine the impression that would have been created with the master and the wardens in their fur-lined robes and their hoods of plonket cloth, seated up there, really lit by these very large windows. And that must have been pretty intimidating for apprentices as they entered this space.
But once you'd learned the subtleties of the pecking order, the guild gave you a defined place in the community, a ready supply of business allies, and even a means of personal advancement.
The guild is an ideal place in which you meet people who might loan you money for a new workshop or to fund a capital project abroad, for example. But they're also a good place to meet the right kinds of people. So they offered their members a range of benefits.
In exchange, the guild expected firm allegiance from its members. These are the seals of the Trinity Guild, cast in medieval times and still used on company documents today. But the group loyal to this emblem back in the 14th century was just one of dozens of guilds in York, all fiercely vying for profit.
Perhaps predictably, these trappings and badges of distinction encouraged not just loyalty, but intolerance. Here in York in 1491, the competitive spirit fostered by the guilds hardened into something altogether more sinister.
Encircling York back then were 2.5 miles of wall built by the Guild of Stonemasons. By 1490, the money was running out, and the job of finishing the city walls was won by the Guild of Tilers, who worked in cheaper brick. That spring, much to the fury of the masons, the tilers started work on the last tower in the fortifications. And it's here at the Red Tower, over 500 years later, that we can still see where this rivalry turned to bloodshed.
We know in August 1490 that the tilers are hard at work on the Red Tower late on a Saturday evening when they're surprised by some of the masons, probably the master mason and his accomplices, who come to the Red Tower and they smash up the tools of the tilers to teach them a lesson. They're worried that their monopoly is being infringed and they really don't like this tendency to build in brick.
At the centre of the trouble was master mason William Hindley. Not as you might think, some local thug, but one of the finest craftsmen in York and a powerful player in civic politics. But the respectable Mason Hindley thought nothing of threatening the tilers with violence. Too bad for one John Patrick.
He was a tiler, so he was responsible for building buildings in brick. He might well have been an itinerant craftsman, perhaps just recently apprenticed or become a journeyman. And it seems that he's just the wrong man in the wrong place at the time.
In October 1491, more than a year into the tilers' work on the tower, John Patrick was ambushed at work and assaulted by William Hindley and an accomplice. He didn't survive the attack.
We don't know how he was killed. The civic records just record that he was murdered, but it's possible, given what had happened with the tools previously, that he might have been battered to death. That wouldn't have been unusual. It would have been particularly ironic, if that was the case, to be murdered with the tools of your own trade, but it's just the sort of thing that I imagine the masons would have wanted to do to make their point.
John Patrick's murder is an extreme example of how desperate people were to protect their positions in a fast-changing world. But it also tells us something about the power of society's new movers and shakers. Guilds could offer solidarity, but it seems in some cases they could also offer immunity from the law. John's murderer, William Hindley, was convicted of the crime, but he spent just 3 days in jail and then left to carry on life as York's master mason.
This ruthless protectionism was the dark side of the emerging competition between the guilds. But fierce group loyalty also gave people their first real alternatives to church and state. The chance to start doing things for themselves. This bridge across the Thames in the small town of Abingdon is an enduring symbol of what the new people power could achieve. Back in the early 1400s, the river here was treacherous and a major obstacle to trade. The townspeople, many of them members of the Holy Cross Guild based here at St Helen's Church, decided to tackle the problem. 2 local merchants started the fund with large donations, and the community raised the rest of the money themselves. Then in 1416, they set to work.
Building the bridge involved, in the course of the proceedings, the entire town in one way or another. Of course, specialist masons were involved. Of course, serious engineers had to be engaged to cope with the very difficult technical aspects. But the shifting of the stones, the moving of the earth, the creating of dikes, this was work that required a lot of hard labour. 300 people working at once, just ordinary people from the town, members of the guild.
We know so much about the bridge building today because of a mildewed document kept in one of the fraternity buildings. It's a poem by an ironmonger and a guild member called Richard Foreman. It's no great work of literature, but it gives an amazingly vivid picture of those summer days while the construction was in full swing.
Of all the works in this world that ever were wrought, Holy Church is chief, and another blessed business is bridges to make. Upon the day of St Alban they began this game, and John Buckins laid the first stone in the King's name. It was solace to see the power of the people proved by the pickaxe, the spades and the shovels.
Borman describes their wives bringing out their lunch, wrapped up in cloths. He says chickens and other meats and drink were brought out and laid out on the grass for picnics for the workers. And he celebrates the whole occasion as a great achievement of the community, of the town, and the bridge itself, therefore, also as a symbol of that community.
To this day, the bridge is proof of the Guild's enterprise. And right across the country, guilds have left a pretty substantial legacy. Many of our roads, schools, hospitals, the building blocks of what we think of today as civil, organised society, owe their existence to this medieval success story.
By the early 1500s, the men and women of Britain must have felt proud of what they'd achieved. They'd answered the oppression of feudalism and the horrors of the Black Death with a robust survival strategy. This had been the 6th age of Britain, and the people were flourishing. But their newfound power wasn't going to go unchecked. Henry VIII's sweeping ecclesiastic reforms were just around the corner. Religious fraternities like the guilds would be outlawed. The established church itself would be torn apart. And as it fell, it would bring the rest of the medieval world tumbling down around it.